I know you wanted to come back on Ella, so you can pick up on what Ella said or what you just said there from Mike Freer.
Well, I think essentially what we need to try and do as a country is try and get the debate to a place where we are realistic about the main threat that's facing us in Britain. And that threat isn't actually social media. It isn't about being nice to one another. It isn't about saying very vague and arguably meaningless things about shared British values when we also can't seem to define what those values are. The threat that's facing us currently, the major threat by a long way, is radical violent Islamism. So firstly, what is our strategy for dealing with that as a country? Around that is being enabled both by mass immigration, which we're not allowed to criticise, a broken policy of multiculturalism, which clearly isn't working because it prioritises group difference over the things that we share in common. And it's being enabled and encouraged by a radicalised cultural left, which is bringing in identity politics, which gives radical Islamists a free pass. So we need to deal with each of these challenges in turn, and we need a national debate that is not driven by liberal commentators inside the M25 who have a moral panic and meltdown any time somebody questions these policies and whether or not they're working, as we saw with Suella Braverman. We need a grown-up discussion like the French are having, like the Germans are having, like the Swedes are having, which is the societies that we're creating in the West, built around large-scale migration with little integration, they're not really working. The Swedes have backtracked. They've done a U-turn on this experiment. The French are now radically changing course. This isn't actually, not everything, Ella, is a free speech issue. Sometimes this is about security and ensuring that you can provide your citizens with the basic thing that a state should give them, which is keeping them safe and secure. And if I'm a British Jew, looking at the events in recent months, by the way, because we've heard very little about Britain's Jewish communities today, outside of the speech by Rishi Sunak, you know, I would have been looking at the events over the last 5 months, Michelle, and probably thinking it's time to leave Britain. And they're asking for a serious response to this as well.
But if you... you know, you make your points about migration, and I think probably a lot of viewers and listeners in this channel will agree in terms of lowering the numbers going forward. But they're particularly, take Rochdale, for example. A lot of the people who voted for Galloway there are their sons and daughters of migrants. They're second-generation people. So I don't really know what you're asking for. Are you
but
but hang on, are you...
survivors
sound like
who introduced...
It starts to sound like you are suggesting that if people don't go along with an official policy of integration, what, are you going to deport them? Are you going to strip them of their citizenship?
I'm saying, no,
put them in jail?
I'll be absolutely clear. Let me be absolutely clear. Like France, firstly, if you're a foreign national glorifying Islamist terrorism, you should be removed from the country. Secondly, if you're a British...
What does glorifying mean? That's the free, where the free speech issue comes
voicing
in.
Support for a prescribed organisation such as Hamas.
But that's different to campaigning. Glorifying is different to campaigning.
Secondly, if you're a British national glorifying Islamist terrorism, we have legislation for that. We have laws that need to be imposed by the police. I think many people watching this channel have spent the last few years feeling as though the police are more interested in taking the knee for Black Lives Matter and demonstrating solidarity with pride flags than doing their job. Yeah. And what worries me more than anything is when public confidence in core public services like the police begins to collapse, we have a real problem. So I think it's quite clear what I'm saying. I would like us to begin by dealing with the challenges that are going to come down the line if we don't start making changes now, while also encouraging these communities within a policy of multiculturalism, which isn't working. It is not succeeding. We have to revisit that. We have to come up with a different policy for integration.
I think that the way to handle this issue is not to deport and lock up our way out of it. I think that is an intolerant and illiberal approach to a challenge in society. Hang on, Matt.
What you're suggesting does cost lives, so you're aware of that, because if we deported many of the asylum seekers that went on to commit Islamist atrocities, like, for example, in Manchester, people wouldn't have lost their lives.
I have no problem with... I think no one will have any problem with deporting and getting rid of people.
You just said you do have a problem with deportation.
I'm talking about people in Rochdale who are second-generation immigrants.
Sure,
but parents of kids. But hang on. I think the interest... If we take the issue of the pro-Palestine marches, what do you have going on there? You have, I think we were talking about this earlier, but there were some technical difficulties on the programme, so you couldn't hear us. You have a large section of people who are on those marches because they look at what's happening in Gaza and they're appalled. And maybe it's sort of almost apolitical. It's just that they think that death and destruction that's happening, whatever the political reasoning behind it, is wrong, and so they're out there. And I wouldn't like them to be labelled with the extremist or anti-Semitic label because it's just not true. But you also have in those protests significant sections of people who are either openly pro-Hamas, unashamedly pro-Hamas, and then a large section of people, quite often from Muslim communities, who are sort of just putting their fingers in their ears and saying, OK, I'll just let this slide because I don't want to go there and having a row about anti-Semitism. Now, I think the way to approach that, without clamping down on protest, without jailing people for having political views, even if they are utterly distasteful, is to have kind of open discussions about the issue of Islamism. You know, if you take the
but what specifically do you do with the Hamas supporters on the marches? What do you do with those? Is this where we just have an open debate about them?
If you are openly calling for physical action and violence,
if I'm wearing a Hamas bandana,
I think it's abhorrent. I think it's terrible. I think it should be criticised.
You would agree with those. You don't agree with them being put in jail?
No, because it all comes down to the issue of what's the long-term gain here? What's the long-term plan?
To eradicate Islamist extremism.
You don't eradicate Islamist extremism by driving it underground and pretending that it doesn't exist by locking it up.
But so the answer is to keep Hamas supporters on the streets wearing Hamas balaclavas, saying to other people, by the way, that voicing support for Islamist terrorism is acceptable in British society.
No, you're being a little bit silly.
No, you said you'd leave them on the streets.
No, hang on, you're being a little bit...
You said you wouldn't take them off the marches.
You're being a little bit...
No, this is a serious issue, Ella.
Okay,
well, let her respond to it then.
You're being a little bit silly because I'm not suggesting that we let it slide. I think we have to make clear that there's a very big difference. And to me, as someone who's feels very, very strongly about freedom of speech and democracy and political action in the masses, there is a big difference between creating social norms and condemning things we disagree with amongst ourselves. And a police.
Words are nice, but we're talking...
Let me finish, Matt.
You're going round in circles.
I'm not going round in circles.
Somebody wearing a Hamas banner is implicitly supporting the atrocities committed against Jews in Israel.
And that is abhorrent.
And they should be allowed to march on Britain's streets, is what you're saying.
I'm saying that we're not going to deal with this issue of rising Islamist threat by simply pretending that we can lock it all up, that we can... that has been... I mentioned the Prevent programme from the beginning of the programme. The government's response to this is to clamp down on protests and just say no one's allowed to say anything. What that message that sends, and we know that this trend in relation to other totally unrelated political issues like the growth of support for Donald Trump or whatever else, that if you push things underground and you say that people can't have debates...
I'm saying uphold the law.
And you say you can't have debates and discuss even very tense things openly...
I said have a debate.
Then what you do is you don't deal with the issue. What I think that the worst response to the vile anti-Semitism we've seen grown on the streets today is to be censorious, because we know what happens with the censorious approach to anti-Semitism.
Well, let's
let the
Hamas supporters run around on Britain's streets with Hamas insignia, because that is surely the cure to the problem of radical Islamism.
Matt,
that is the opposite of what we should be doing. And if I was a member of Britain's Jewish communities listening to this is exactly the problem with Britain. What you're trying to paint me as is somebody that just wants to lock everybody up and forget that we have a problem. Well, no, let me be clear.
You said deport and jail.
Yeah, I said deport foreign nationals who glorify Islamist terrorism, which is what the French are doing and it's what the Germans are doing. I then said, secondly, if you are showing Hamas insignia, if you are expressing support for Hamas on Britain's streets, that is breaking the law. You should be arrested and you should be put in prison. This is not hard. This isn't about free speech. This is about upholding the British rule of law.
It is about free speech. We could go into a row about hate speech laws. We could go into a row about what's currently allowed in terms of political expression. This government's response to difficult and entangled political issues like we've seen played out in Rochdale is to simply press the ban button. That's inadequate. It will not do anything for either protecting the Jewish community or furthering proper, open, substantial discussions about what's happening in Israel and Gaza. I think, Matt, I'm afraid that you have gone down a rather dark...
Here we go. I'm the only one on this panel, Ella, saying we should uphold the law.
Well, there are lots of things. There are lots of things about the law that I disagree with.
Well, apparently, yeah. I look forward to the Hamas metropolis you're going to build.
I didn't know that you were such a fan of the government and lawmaking. The question here is: are you for free speech or are you not? And I think you've lost that freedom bone.
I would not want to live in a society created by Ella Whelan. Let's put it that way.
Right. This conversation will continue in a second.